Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. This is one of our webinars in the series called The Future of Consultancy. And I'm really excited to say that we're going to be talking about project speed today and a particular focus on risk and learning about risk, reflecting on how we approach risk and our role in that as consultants. So a little bit of sort of learning in CPD for you today, hopefully slightly lighter touch than those of you who might have been watching the budget earlier. This will be a nice, relaxing, enjoyable hour and hopefully interesting for you. So I'm Hannah Vickers, I'm the Chief Exec of the ACU. So I will be chairing and hosting today. I'm delighted that we've got Tim Chapman, who is our director at Arup, who is going to be taking us through a bit of a mini lecture, isn't it? We're calling it, Tim, around risk. And it's all sort of looking at it through the lens of project speed. So what do we need to be doing? What do we need to be thinking about in terms of risk to help us unlock better, faster, greener delivery of projects? So there's a lot of learning you can take into your advice to clients, but even if you're acting in the supply chain, there's a lot that you can take away from today's presentation. So this is, we're going to spend about 40 minutes with Tim, just sharing the outputs from some research he's been working on around risk over the last sort of 6 to 12 months. And then we're going to open the floor for Q&A. So please do pop your questions into the chat bar and I will pick them up at the end. You can do that at any time. Also, if you haven't joined us before, just a few kind of housekeeping things. So please feel free to put your questions in at any point. That's fine. I will pick them up at the end and field them to Tim. We do it anonymously, so don't be afraid. If you want to say something controversial, that's absolutely fine. I won't unmask you through the medium of the webinar. And lastly, just to say that we will be uploading this. So we're going to be recording today and we will be uploading this onto our website so that you can listen to it again. You can share it with your colleagues. It will be sort of open access for everyone. So just to make sure that you're fully aware. Okay, so as I said, this is a second in a number of webinars we are holding on the future of consultancy. I'll come back at the end of this and just remind you of some of the others, but I think for now I would like to introduce Tim. So Tim, you're going to take us through for about 40 minutes or so with the insights and the outputs from your presentation and from your research that you've undertaken. Really looking forward to hearing it.
Thanks, Hannah. I'm just pulling it up on the screen as we speak. And hopefully you can now see it.
Yes.
Excellent. That was the worrying part in the Zoom world, that and leaving your mic off. So thank you really for the opportunity to actually do this. And this is something which has been burned deep in me. I think for those of you who know me for a long time, I'm originally a geotechnical engineer. So my whole career has been spent dealing with risk. So the opportunity to actually do the research alongside Hannah and the AC on this was absolutely really welcome. So let's go into my first slide. I mean, fundamentally, why do projects go wrong? Largely, they're not on time and on budget. And over on the right, I show one of the few prime ministers to stand proudly in front of a project and say it was on time and on budget, which was High Speed 1. And at that time, Tony Blair remarked on the fact that actually how rare an opportunity that was. So basically, this is about risks, but also the flip side of risks or opportunities. And there's lots of different types of that can happen. So for the technical risks, discovering a huge geological feature or an old mine shaft during delivery, absolutely catastrophic. Stakeholder risks, and actually we tend to quite often, I think, underestimate these, because often they mean the projects don't happen. So all the failed projects, all the types of projects where the client couldn't quite get the funding in place or the local community to agree to it or whatever else, are very major risks to projects. The very simple ones of happening on time and on budget, which happens hopefully a lot of the time, but then doesn't deliver the desired outcomes. So it opens, but things don't happen the way everyone hoped it would do. Or it happens on time, on budget, and delivers direct outcomes, but also undermines some other fundamental aims. So maybe you're building a baked bean factory and you make lots of baked beans, but you do it not in the most carbon efficient way. Or it happens on time and on budget, but the project turns out to be ill-conceived and it folds. And there's many examples of infrastructure projects actually all over the world where somebody set out in a major capital project and it was built, but then it was unable to operate properly afterwards and then it sort of fell into disrepair. Or it happens on time and on budget and is too successful and then it's be substantially modified very soon after opening at great expense. And just highlights the fact that we don't build our projects to be flexible. We always assume that on opening day, we cut the ribbon and so there's a da-da moment. But often, many of them, and especially actually transport schemes, end up being too successful and end up being modified again very quickly afterwards, but actually at great expense because we didn't make it easy for that to happen. So there are lots of ways that projects can actually go wrong one way or another. And again, there's various risk categories. So the RICS and others have done some excellent publications on this, all of which are out there in the press, and most of you have actually probably read them, looking at the various risk categories: business and political and business, benefit, consequential, project program, and design development, construction, employer change, and employer other risks. But actually, when things go wrong, we quite often ask who's at fault. And quite often the blame game around projects ends up being costing a lot more and taking a lot longer than actually just sorting out the problems right in the first place. So the client can be at fault, either setting the wrong brief, establishing the wrong team, or doing the wrong procurement process. The concept team can be at fault because they fail to deduce what needs to be done properly and what outcome is required, and therefore set off the project in the wrong way. The design team sometimes fail to balance the constraints to produce the best solution. And especially a time-constrained design team don't have enough time to go through them and to do this properly. The delivery team fail to marshal the logistics and the supply chain to deliver on time and properly. The operational readiness team aren't ready for smooth initiation into operation. And the regulator and planning authority sometimes are failing to set the right context. So big infrastructure clients or all sorts of clients dance the tunes that are set. And if the regulator or planning authority don't say what they're trying to achieve properly, then it's possible that the clients aren't going the right direction, as an example on net zero carbon or others. But actually, we should ask, why is fault the right lens? Because we shouldn't be so defensive. The critical thing is setting up projects actively for success. Concentrate on making the success happen and not worrying about who to blame for expected failure. So therefore, on my list on my last slide, I'd like to add the lawyers for making it all about blame and not enough about setting up projects to be successful from the outset, making sure that we resource teams properly, we have enough time, and we can follow through. So in terms of setting up projects for success, we need to think probably about three key things. First of all, it's the fundamental mission. What's the tangible thing that you want to create? Like, for instance, Department of Education seeking to build 150 new schools. In parallel, what are the outcomes that you want to achieve? Like raising educational standards in a number of target areas where the schools have become dilapidated and kids just aren't getting the proper education. And especially the values that you want to achieve in parallel with delivery, e.g. transforming towards net zero carbon. So as Hannah said at the beginning, better, faster, greener needs changes in how we do things, and especially actually more open to innovation for continuous improvement. It was Albert Einstein who said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And serial clients, those who actually keep on building repeatedly, and especially building similar things repeatedly, have a chance to continually improve better than anybody else can. So they should stimulate innovation in their supply chain. And quite often a key part of that is actually having a really good research roadmap. So Apple or Samsung with their phones have a research roadmap. They go forward 3 or 4 phone models out into the future, and they've got their battery producers, screen producers, and everybody else knowing what's required in the future and actively researching to make sure that they're engaged and can meet the demand that's going to come in time. Also critically, innovation might fail. So you need to limit the blame culture on that, but also don't innovate when critical. So as an example, in rolling out the COVID vaccine, that's not a good time to actually be innovative, although maybe it's also the time to try and be innovative because we have to try and cut corners in ways we never thought of before. And obviously with any set of innovation, it's measuring the outcomes and making sure we disseminate the learning. So some clients are very scared of innovation, and actually in many cases innovation is inappropriate. So we need to help those clients, especially serial clients, to understand when they should be able to innovate and when they should be able to stimulate us towards helping them improve. Because actually an extra type of failure is the project to just keep on getting more and more expensive to deliver something that does the same. We actually should be aiming to produce projects that aren't just better and greener, but actually cheaper as well. And that's possible and within our grasp. We need to make sure that our clients can do more and engage with us more. So in terms of the client, the critical thing is setting the overall approach right. So an awful lot more pre-planning is needed for most cases. And in that pre-planning, they need to know what, who, and then how. So what is it they're trying to do? And especially what is it they're trying to do in the context of themselves as a client body? So is it something that could actually totally devastate the client in the future? Or is it something which actually is quite minor and just another one of the various things that they're doing? Who they're going to bring with them on the journey. So making sure that they actually work out how to deploy the team with the right people, the right bodies, in the right way. And then finally, how, working out how they're going to deliver it. So how can we help clients do this better? Well, working with Hannah as part of the ACE and working for the Construction Innovation Hub, we've had a team on this for the last 6 months. And a key part of this team is trying to actually set up the projects for success much better. So in parallel with the standard technical processes of REBA and GRIP, we've come up with what we call the integrated process diagram, which is trying to make sure that we look at each of these 4 swim lanes of client approach, risk, value definition, and value measurement strategy, coming together at key investment decision points to work out what should be happening alongside the standard design processes. So for instance, in REBA, we're going through the design, we're working out how thick the slabs are, where the beams are, how to integrate the services into the building or whatever it might do for a piece of infrastructure. But this is not setting up the project for success, it's just making sure the solution is well defined. And this whole process I'm really excited about because I think it's going to enable our whole industry to engage better with our clients and give them better guidance about how to work with us. I'm just going through the 4 swim lanes going to define in a little bit more detail now. But in parallel, it's looking at the actual values that we want to create. So we go through the 4 capitals, and as part of a parallel stream of the CIH work has been actually going through this in great detail and working out what the right way to do it is, and making sure this ties into international best practice. So they've reduced the sort of 6 or 5 capitals down to 4 of natural capital, human capital, social capital, and produce capital. And Natalie Kropp from Tony G has been leading on this. And for one that is very dear to my heart, climate change is in the middle of natural capital. So some of these values might actually be more major than others. And very strongly, each client will work out which of them matter and which of them they want to achieve. And clients who try and achieve everything probably will achieve none of them. So it's really important to actually focus them down and make sure they set out the ones that are really critical for what they're trying to achieve as an organization. Also important to this is, as I said before, is the client knowing enough about themselves, working out their inherent client characteristics and also their attributes and attitudes to work out their client profile. So this, some well-educated clients who deal often with the construction industry have worked these things out and actually know them fairly well and know how they should deploy themselves alongside everybody else. But not enough clients think about this, and especially one-off clients who deal with our industry most frequently, the ones who need most help, we need to help them actually identify how they should engage with us. And so basically we should be thinking about opportunity and risk as choosing and then achieving the right outcomes and values and deploying the right team in the right way to be on time and on budget and to achieve a whole range of other success metrics. And in this, for deploying the team, the construction playbook, which came out at the end of last year, talks about 5 delivery models. And these are based on the ones that we've been working on as part of the CIH work. So 2 of them are very conventional, the sort of transactional one, the client that we deal with very often, who is very mercantile, and in many cases, the rational approach and right way forward. And sort of the hands-on leadership, the very the clients who need to engage with many stakeholders and need to keep a very tight control on what's happening around them. So you might think about big infrastructure projects like Crossrail or High Speed 2 for the second one. But what we've done is we've actually boiled down 3 transformational delivery models: our product mindset, hands-off design, and trusted helper. And these are key ways that clients can actually deploy their team for success. Product mindset fits in very strongly with the way of actually trying to produce mobile phones or producing 150 schools or doing 14 sewage treatment works or whatever else, where basically the strapline is I need lots of these, but I need them to get better, greener, and faster. And in doing that, there's a chance to invest in the supply chain. The critical and really difficult thing is a client bundling all of their projects together into this big program of work. If we try and do 150 schools as 150 separate schools with 150 separate design teams, we never get a chance to improve. The price just goes up, but especially the product doesn't improve. So the really beautiful thing about this is that there should be large efficiencies in terms of assembly and DFMA, etc. However, the product should get significantly better as well. We should be able to produce schools that actually are the right size, give better learning environments. And as an example, we actually can employ really good lighting designers to come in and make sure that we provide the right type of ambient lighting at various times of the day so that people can study better and be more collaborative. Hands-off design is actually one that might seem a bit of an anathema to the construction industry. It's basically just trying to solve the problem the client has in terms of the outcome. So an example for this might be an airport client who needs to build a new car park, but actually finds, but if they can actually find, if they get a different way of the flights arriving, might find they don't need a new car park at all. And possibly might find in doing so that the planes can even deploy the planes and their crews better. So you might look upon this as a disappointment, but it shouldn't be. Our clients got a better answer, and they will want to come back and engage with the construction industry again. So it's a huge success. And the final one on this list is the trusted helper, which fits very strongly in with the Project 13 integrator. It's where basically the client says, I need somebody to come and help me and do this for me without me having to tell you how it needs to be done. So the trusted helper comes in, knows the client systems and especially safety systems better than the client does, and therefore can be really, really efficient, but especially end up with no mistakes being made. So the final part of this that we're looking at before we get into the delivery phase is basically the thing I've called stop blaming procurement. All too often, we blame the procurement tail for wagging the dog. But actually, the critical thing on this is we need to make sure that we set up procurement for success. And in doing that, we need to work out what the commercial strategy should be by working out how to, once we know the delivery model and how we're going to deploy the team, work out a scope and package it, reward and incentivize it, and develop the contract strategy. And I should say, Emma Jane Houghton, now in the hospital program, did a huge amount of work on this, working alongside it was absolutely really good. And her insights on this were tremendous. As part of that also is actually how does DnB help? And yes, in many cases, it's really useful to get the design and build contractor to come in and manage large parts of the process. And one of the really nice things about the delivery models is it's agnostic of that. All of them can be done well by DnB, but in many cases, there's actually advantages in going forward with your traditional design team and making sure we get increased project definition before we actually engage with the contractor. So it's agnostic on which one that we actually follow. We can get the benefits of both. And finally, opening successfully is really well. I'm old enough to remember when Heathrow T5 opened, and a really good project was mired by everybody because the opening day didn't go well. They tried to do a big bang opening and move a huge number of flights across to a new terminal without the staff being properly cleared and not even knowing where to park their cars at this new location. So operational readiness is key, and actually the client not making decisions for change on the process delivery is also fairly key. So the client butting out and making sure that they just think about what they should be doing, which is preparing for opening at this stage, is much more useful. There's an extra bar here on the risk bar called design integration, recognizing that a critical stage overall is the team needing to come together. So especially in cases of DnB, but actually in every case, the contractors team needs to actually integrate the shop drawings with the design team and making sure there's no misunderstandings. Because once delivery starts and once that big juggernaut starts running, change becomes incredibly expensive. So time at this stage, making sure that there's a fully integrated design before delivery starts is absolutely critical. So in the context for risk, delivering projects successfully involves knowing the risk profile and actually the overall tolerance of risks, looking at the risk portfolio and thinking big picture, understanding risk complexity, thinking about a risk currency that's not always about money or time, the importance of risk elevation and bringing in board, the senior board involved with it especially, and having a risk mindset always, thinking about opportunities all the way through are really key. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn. So the risk profile is about the overall approach to risk tolerance or appetite, finding out what the client can manage and what client can't manage. Some clients are very well resourced. If it overruns, it doesn't matter, and actually getting the outcome is more critical for them. Other clients, especially ones, government clients who've got very narrow sources of funding and which has to be used by a particular time, have got very low risk tolerance and therefore a very low risk appetite and are really susceptible to changes happening and therefore need to be even more careful than other client types. How critical is the project for the organization's success? We all can imagine what happens if Amazon flunk taking down their website one day and it not working. And we can imagine the pressure that's on the web developers to make sure it's really well tested before it goes back into operation. Likewise, I mean, the main runway in Gatwick Airport, a really busy airport, or what used to be a really busy airport with only one runway, is absolutely critical. So if we go and do works on their runway overnight, it is absolutely critical that we can get off in time and leave time for a little bit of float for things that don't work well. How inherently risky is the project? Is it a project that actually has got lots of new and novel features or with actually lots of innovation in it? or is it actually tried and tested and the supply chain are well known and are well versed in actually how to deliver it? And especially how significant is it for achieving the wider goals? If those are goals of the wider organization, it may be hugely significant towards that goal doing it. As an example, on net zero, many clients are trying to push and show their net zero credentials. So they may want to burnish them or not by the projects that they're doing at the moment. And finally, what would be the effects of risks coming to fruition? How affordable are they in many currencies? And I'm going to talk about a range of risk currencies next. And at a portfolio level, we talk about the project, but actually the program can be more important. And this is a really excellent graphic from the IPA report from about 3 years ago called Transforming Infrastructure Performance. And it looks at the various objectives you might have, both dealing with the project, then the project is nested into the asset base and is a functioning part of that, which fits into the overall network, which fits into the wider system. So the project, we want to be safe, on time and on budget, etc., low carbon, maybe digitally enabled delivery. The asset performance really matters about the benefits that it actually brings, the availability, sustainability and resilience in terms of the asset system. In terms of the overall network, high-performing networks for capacity, resilience, availability, and interconnected, especially nowadays. And then the wider systems of national productivity, national growth, national low-carbon objectives, back to the NIC things, how does it fit into these things? And then various measures on the right-hand side. So current risk methods are very mature, they're well developed, we've been trying to do them for a long time. ISO 31000 2018's most recent edition says how it's done, and very crudely, risk severity equals likelihood times consequences. Very often we go along and we draw a 5x5 matrix and we work out actually where we are in that. And very often, traditionally, we actually look at the consequences and we try and apportion them to various people around the thing. The critical thing is about managing the risks. All too often, a portion actually means, will you manage it, but also will you accept the consequences? And the right organization to manage the risk might not be the right organization to accept the consequences. But this whole risk dumping philosophy ends up actually doing the clients an awful lot of disservice at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, the client actually owns the consequences anyway. They deal with the stakeholders, they deal with the communities, they deal with the service, the people who require the services provided. But if they paid a huge premium for risk being managed that's not managed well, then they've actually lost twice over. They've lost the money they paid for it to be run, and they still have to deal with the consequences. And just touching on the right-hand side of this slide, there's again lots of other publications. I talked about the RICS book earlier on. There's books, the Orange book by the Treasury, the Green book, the IPA, Improving Project Delivery, Project Initiation Route Map, and various reports about NAO and their DECA process. Lots of ways of actually dealing with this. But a fundamental part of this lecture is I'm not a fan of the 5x5 matrix for managing all types of risks. I think the whole basis of apportioning risks and looking at all the risks is very tame, often neglects the huge severity of the more difficult and more complex risks, and I'll talk about those later on as well. And the traditional approaches of dealing with risk are basically accept, transfer, reduce, or avoid, or tolerate, transfer, treat, or terminate. And these, while sound quite glib, actually cause me quite a lot of anxiety, because from a client point of view, we either can accept a risk or we can try and reduce or mitigate it. But the whole point about actually just transferring risks is never a full response. When it is being done, it needs to be done incredibly thoughtfully, and especially with the actual concern that the risk might rebound back into the client organization in a very major way, because just transferring it and forgetting about it is not a good way forward. If it's a significant risk, if you transfer it, you're losing control, and you may well end up losing visibility as well, and those are really unhelpful. So for more complicated risks, I'm going to push hugely in this lecture for the need to mitigate and not deal with things by contingency. The 5x5 matrix, where we actually look at things, we put a price on various risks, we multiply by the likelihood and come up with a risk pot, is not a proper risk pot. That's not a proper contingency. That amount of money very seldom deals with all of the risks that may come about. And clients who think that it is are unfortunately misled by their advisors. In terms of risk complexity, David Hancock of the Cabinet Office wrote an excellent book in 2010 called Tame, Messy and Wicked Risk Leadership. And in this, he moved away from the fact, and like I say, tame risks are those that are very easy to control. They're linear and simple, they're resolvable. So as an example, if you just pick the wrong excavator to come to a site and you find out it just cannot do the work that's required, you can go and hire another excavator, and all that you lost is the actual hire charge for the first one. Those sort of risks are actually really easy, and while they might be amenable to sort of 5x5 management, they're not the ones where most attention should be paid. David split the more complicated risks into two categories. He spoke about ones due to behavioral complexity, politics, ethics, which he called wicked risks, and those due to dynamic system complexity, which he called messy risks. And these are the ones, and especially the risks that are actually wicked and messy, are the ones that actually we should spend most time on projects dealing with. And again, dealing with risk by itself is quite a loaded question, because dealing with it suggests that there's actually a way of doing it properly. We want to deal with risk properly, don't just actually transfer it to somebody else. And I'm going to come on to the concept of the Scotch egg of risk reduction in a second. But before I do that, I just want to actually read and remind you of the great Donald Rumsfeld quote from almost 2 decades ago. He said about events in Iraq, he said, reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That's to say, we know that there are some things we do not know, but there are also the unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history of our country and other free countries, it's the latter category that tend to be the difficult ones. So working on a major project, I was working with the risk team, and they explained about the Scotch egg of risk reduction to me, how they started out at the beginning with a very, very well-formed bundle of risks, some of which were the known knowns and some which were the unknown unknowns. And they explained to me what they were trying to do was basically, if you imagine a Scotch egg, they were trying to actually turn the whole Scotch egg into egg. They wanted the core, the egg part, to expand out and eventually reach the edge, so that all of the known unknown risks eventually became known ones. And this is obviously a really good aspiration. But they then looked at me depressed and said, but the critical thing is, as we deliver this really complicated project, all of the unknown risks kept on materializing. So as fast as they could actually make the egg part expand, the whole Scotch egg was expanding even quicker, and the risk battle became quite a major one. This was actually a very well-tooled and very sensible risk team who actually acknowledged what was happening, were on top of it. But all too often, the risk spreadsheet approach just leads to the unknown risks not actually being fully recorded because they weren't recorded at the beginning. And especially for very complicated programs of work, most of these risks aren't actually even discoverable at the beginning. It's not a problem the team didn't spot risks they should have done. They were just risks that could not be known about, because we all know that major projects are really complicated with lots of issues that arise during execution. So risk currency. There's the traditional ones of cost and time. So very often from this, we tend to think about risk in terms of pound terms. Actually, there's threats to the outcomes and threats to values not being achieved. And these are often more difficult ones. So it's a really important point to make sure that we think about risk in terms other than just plain pounds, because pounds actually just misses the point. If we build a new school and if it's a little bit late or overdue, it might be more expensive. However, if the school doesn't do what we said it was meant to do, there's a threat to the outcomes being achieved. And that's actually an awful lot worse. So we actually fail to raise the educational standards in the area by not having an inspiring school. And if the school is meant to be both inspiring and low carbon, and we fail to actually make it low carbon as well, we have the same school for another 30 or 40 years. We're not going to be able to make it low carbon until the next major intervention. So we've missed many things. And you cannot put the price of not raising educational standards, not achieving low carbon, or whatever other metrics you might want to put into this, not creating apprenticeships, not respecting nature in pound terms. These are not amenable to explanation in pound terms. So risk needs to be expressed in a much richer range of currencies than just pounds. Another thing I want to just emphasize is the importance of board involvement. Again, too often risk management on projects ends up being a bit of a ghetto. You might have some very good people in the middle of it, but they're largely ignored by people at board level. And this is actually bonkers, because people at board level are paid the big salaries to make sure that they're in charge of things. And in terms of some major projects, I've seen the thermocline of truth applied. So they're basically recognizing that as we look at projects becoming increasingly dashboarded, it's almost sort of, there's a barrier between board understanding what's really happening on the ground and what they see on the dashboard. And if you're in the middle of the project and if you're actually in charge of one of the buttons and your button is green and you know things are deteriorating, but you know it's deteriorating across the whole project, and you know other people have not yet pressed their button and turned it from green to red, it takes somebody who's very brave, in this case, to actually press their button. And if those people are being incentivized, or if their organization has been incentivized to keep the button green, again, that's an extra complication. So on major projects, there is an issue of dashboarding, meaning the board things get hidden from the board. And I was talking to a major contractor about this, and they said that it's a well-known phenomenon, and they call it the watermelon of traffic light indicators. Basically, everything is green on the outside, but glowing bright red in the middle. So dashboarding has advantages. However, it can also be a major barrier to making sure that proper risk management gets up to board level. And board level is where it should be at. Those are the people who should be charging and able to spot and detect the more complicated risks, because they are answerable for the successful delivery of the project at the end of the day. So as part of this, with the ACE-CIH work, we've come up with a sort of a values-based risk profiler of looking at traditional ways of managing risk, which are fine for very simple projects. So if you're putting up a logistics shed in the middle of an industrial park and everything is well known, everything is well controlled, everything should be going really well, we can probably use a more traditional approach. But for most projects, and again, someone commented a while ago, we're doing the more risky projects nowadays because all the easy ones were done 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago. We need a much more active level of risk profiling. And sometimes we need to go to the highest category that we've called fully rational. So we need to be more risk aware. We need especially to be alive to the complicated side of the wicked and messy risks. And actually, we need to reward the team for openness and not punish them for it. The client leadership need to be involved and informed, and actually, as we go up the board, into actually immersed in the risk management processes with full transparency that inspires the team. So in terms of the risk method that we're proposing, and most of this is actually fairly simple and straightforward, obviously identify known and unknown risks at the beginning as far as prescience allows, pick up your original risk profile and full understanding of the risk potential, then risk assessment, work out how to deal with the risks that have been identified, and then monitor the risk with full transparency of reporting, basically encouraging people to whistleblow as early as possible. And this loop is repeated all the way through the project at regular intervals. And one really interesting part of this is actually what we call the pre-mortem. So the standard approach to risks, unfortunately, being in a spreadsheet, lends itself to being very amenable to cutting and pasting. So all too often, people just cut and paste the standard risks from a previous project and put them into a new spreadsheet, put a new header on it, possibly a new job number, and then call it, say, this is our risk profile for the project. But actually, critically, that sort of groupthink avoids the need, gets away from the need to think properly about what might go wrong in the project. The pre-mortem is a concept where key project participants are asked to go away and write a very short essay by themselves as to why the project might go wrong. And actually, it's really good fun. And quite often people produce 2 or 3 essays, but it ends up being really, really exploratory and a very good way to unearth the proper ways that the project might go wrong. And often unearth an awful lot more of the less technical and more stakeholder management-y side of risks, because these are the critical ones. And then we can do the same thing repeatedly at various stages through the project. So yes, we're now at the stage of getting ready for delivery. What do we now think are the critical things? We've actually mitigated a large number of the risks we saw at the outset, but what are the new risks? So periodically doing a pre-mortem is actually really revealing, as well as actually being great fun. There's a really interesting book. Again, as a geotechnical engineer, I'm always interested in radical uncertainty. So when the ex-head of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, along with John Kay, wrote a book called Radical Uncertainty last year, it made me really interested. And Andrew Crudgington recommended it to me. And I read it with glee. And it was really interesting understanding how economists have dealt with risk, because they'll deal with risk that costs an awful lot more money than we do in the construction industry. And they can crash a whole economy in terms of the risk that they manage. And they talk about a concept of reflexivity, which is a really distinctive property of social systems and one that we tend to far too often ignore in how we deliver major projects. The fact that the system itself is influenced by beliefs about it and changes according to what's done. And this hugely describes how we deal with stakeholders. All too often, major projects might recognize a particular set of stakeholders as a risk, but doesn't actually pick up the point that if it treats them really badly, those people will have their backs put up and will actually react much more strongly about the project than they would do otherwise. And therefore, we come to the concept of the landing pad, a very time-bound solution to trying to solve and land to get rid of a lot of risks, where you might do a very complicated set of negotiation to arrive at a very, very narrow landing pad to enable things to happen. I often find also in these cases, least bad is sometimes more meaningful than best, because best actually becomes ambiguous, but least bad, look at the consequences of things that might go wrong, as more meaningful. So just picking up the various delivery models. The transactional one is the one that's often used and in my experience often carries the biggest risks. It's great if you know what you're doing, and if you have a very well-defined scheme at the beginning, you can go in with a GMP, guaranteed maximum price, and a contractor will deliver it. But once change happens, and especially a lot of change happens due to a range of uncertainties taking place, then how you deal with that change becomes incredibly difficult. And you come to some of the problems that led to actually the creation of the NEC form of contract. Hands-on leadership is good. We need to recognize it's not always the cheapest way of doing things, but it's a way of managing risks and steering around risks in a much more agile way and nimble way, and basically staying on top of them much more in a better way. The product mindset is superb for cases of innovation and making sure we do things, but if change is required, if we're doing 150 schools and we're trying to do it in a very regimented way, change complicates everything hugely and can destroy a lot of the benefits you're trying to achieve. Hands-off design is very good, but actually it's only very good if you can delegate the power to deliver to people who are just concentrating on the outcome. If the how you do it matters, it can actually be very bad, because if you just tell people to go off and solve my problem, they will not necessarily going to do it, understand the full range of risks that you're dealing with, unless you actually explain far too much, and then you actually stand up not being a hands-off design process. And finally, the trusted helper is almost analogous to hands-on leadership. It's where the client, rather than employing their own team, employs somebody else to come and do it for them. And again, it leads to an awful lot more active management of risk, so it's done a lot better. So the critical features for successful risk management are a nimble and engaged client behaving rationally, with the client board looking at this and not being afraid to confront and not being scared by risks as they actually confront them. Spending time up front to think through the issues and not accidentally lurching into a process. Prepared to devote enough time and money to doing things properly. Paying the right amount for a suitably knowledgeable team. The price point is absolutely critical. Working out, but that price point only becomes meaningful if it has the right amount of definition around it. And again, right people in a well-functioning team with enough time usually will be a large part of actually making sure you avoid risks fully. Not believing that risk can be fully, key risks especially, can be fully delegated. They can be managed by others, but not delegate the consequences. Delegating the consequences can be very dangerous. And basically, if you do all of these things, you should hopefully avoid unexpected shocks and nasty surprises, but also enables you to seize the right opportunities. And my final slide is just going to quote John Ruskin, the great 19th century philosopher. He said, "It's unwise to pay too much, but it's unwise to pay too little. When you pay too much, you lose a little money, that's all. When you pay too little, you sometimes lose everything, because the thing you bought was incapable of doing the thing it was bought to do. The common law business balance prohibits paying a little and getting a lot. It just can't be done. If you deal with the lowest bidder, it's as well to add something for the risk you run. And if you do that, you will have enough to pay for something better." And that whole approach, I think, fundamentally goes through everything that we buy in life, but especially how we buy construction. So Hannah, back over to you again. That's the end of the lecture. Oh, it's exactly 40 minutes in.
Perfect timing. That was very good timekeeping, Tim. Absolutely brilliant and fascinating as well. I like that you brought it to life. I'm, big fan of the watermelon reporting. Take a risk. It's yeah, it livens it up. So we've got a couple of questions come in, and I've had some sent to me as well. So I'll just pose these to you, Tim. We may want to just have a bit of a conversation around them, and just to encourage everybody on the call as well to keep sending them through, because we have got the opportunity here to pick Tim's brains, and I hope from the presentation just you can see there's quite a lot to go and pick at. So I've got a question here. I'm not going to say it's wrong because I told you I wouldn't do that. This is somebody who is looking at commenting on procurement and saying that actually the fact that procurement input is early in the project lifecycle, it's the prompt for the first time clients and project teams are challenged to think about how the projects and the program should be delivered. So often it ends up with procurement having to resolve a lot of those challenges. So what's our role? And I'll put this to you as a consultant, and more generally on behalf of the industry, what do you think can be done to make sure that delivery models are a high priority and that you actually have appropriate experienced professionals involved in developing that upfront strategy before you get to the procurement process itself?
I think it's probably more of a statement than a question, because I mean, or a very rhetorical one. So the number of parts of this whole approach that we're doing between AC and CIH that I actually feel really proud of, and I think colouring in the detail around this and making sure that clients are rationally looking at these questions early on is absolutely critical. I mean, all too often, I mean, experienced clients know this. So we're dealing with some of the clients who do this all the time. They know they need to have processes that happen in parallel. But all too often, getting to the end of the process, all the design comes back fully done, the documents are there ready to be launched, and suddenly it's, oh, yes, now I need to do something with this. And then launching into procurement as an afterthought is absolutely fundamentally wrong. So what I really like about this is proper professionals engage with the client, helping the client to ask the right questions, and all the way through this in parallel with what might be quite a lengthy design process. And again, some of the people we've dealt with this in sort of the beta testing version of it. So more mature clients may be on top of this and be able to do it generically. So if you're a major serial developer or a government department or Highways England Network Rail, you'll have your own processes for doing this. But even they, I think, benefit if they're open to it, to going back and thinking again about their processes. And I think we've actually gone back. We tried to boil down all the questions that should be asked in a very rational way. So I agree with the prod and what's largely like a rhetorical question, that we, the industry, need to be far better at helping our clients through those early stages and not just distracted by, is it red, is it green, is it blue, how thick is the slab type of questions. At the same time, we should be doing very actively engaged with making sure we set up the project for success, as well as making sure the solution is right.
Okay, great. So it sounds like something that Arup will be getting involved with then.
Okay.
All right, so I've got a question about a specific type of risk. So this is about stakeholder risk. So can stakeholder risk management now be considered a separate discipline? And particularly in complex infrastructure projects, does it warrant a separate approach and strategy? So what's your view on kind of categorizing risk like that, Tim? Would you think it's a more holistic conversation?
I mean, answer the question. I mean, I think it already is a separate discipline, and people do it. Sometimes those are people who are divorced from the main process. So actually, better. One of the arguments here is to do everything very holistically. So too often, I think stakeholder management is done by people who are disconnected from the main process. So there needs to be better engagement between stakeholder managers and the design team to make sure that the various things that they're presenting are commitments that the project can deliver on. But yeah, I think it's already a separate discipline. I think it's a very proud and noble discipline, and we need to recognize that one of the main ways of actually reducing one of the biggest risks to a project. The bit about a separate approach and strategy, I think I disagree with, but I don't think it's probably meant that way. It's a distinct approach and strategy as part of the overall strategy, but needs to be fully integrated with everything else that's happened. Happening.
As you say, perhaps recognize, certainly when you look at the delivery models, you can see how at least understanding the complexity of the stakeholder environment would drive you towards different delivery models. So it's absolutely something that should be sort of central to your thinking in that. Okay, so I've got another one around skills and capability, and I definitely know you have a view on this, Tim. So do consultancy organisations need to upskill or reskill to be able to support our clients to manage risks more effectively? What does a mature consultancy look like from a risk management perspective? So do your worst, Tim, on that one.
Well, Hannah, you might want to actually, do you want to actually offer a few more thoughts? Because I mean, you've been leading this with the ACE, and I've hugely admired the Future of Consultancy campaign that you've been pushing, because I mean, this is all part of the same thing. Do you want to talk first, and then I'll add on to what you say at the end?
Yeah, okay, no, we can do. So I think there's absolutely a shift in skill set here. We have been, as with many of our disciplines, quite sort of technical and process focused. So there was a bit of, you sort of alluded to how the risk may be managed in spreadsheets, Tim. I think that is very sort of procedural risk management. I think perhaps what we need to move into with your the sort of different risk categorization that you've set out for us here, Tim, to my mind, opens up actually some broader sort of social sciences skills. If you're looking at kind of category 2 being around risk to delivering the values, you really want people who understand those values and understand the behavioural or cultural changes required to actually deliver them in the wider sort of stakeholder environment there. So I think, again, we're moving perhaps away from QSs with spreadsheets managing risk into a sort of a more diverse team that can really think about, and perhaps is drawn from the value profile of that project, really sort of taking that as your steer as to who should be in the conversation about what are the risks to delivering that value. And by the same token, I think there is a sort of seniority point here. So some of the most sort of complex and wicked and messy risks in the kind of category 3 are really about sort of political sort of end game type events, and I think that lends itself to having some of those senior stakeholders in the same conversation, as again I think you sort of touched on a bit in the presentation, Tim. So you sort of have, if you like, a more sort of balanced, slightly more diverse group of people, and how we think about drawing those together into that conversation where you know the QSs who do the sort of kind of costed risk management absolutely have a place, but how do we bring them together with the board level senior stakeholders who can take on the sort of political risks and, you know, some of these more perhaps niche areas where we've got the values defined and the risks to delivering those values. I think it needs to be a blend of all of those people, which I've never seen a risk conversation between those different groups take place on a project.
Yeah, I'm just sorry to add to what you're saying. I mean, I joined Arup a third of a century ago, and I joined a firm then with 5 skills networks. Now there's 50. So I think major consultancies are changing, have transformed a huge amount. And again, I mean, Hannah, I mean, you changed the organization name from the ACE was no longer consulting engineers, consultancy and engineering. And the same thing actually applies to everything that we do. So I think all consultants now are much broader in terms of the range of disciplines that we can bring, and especially even recognizing that probably the more technical disciplines will be commoditized. So that's a lot of what I cut my teeth on as a young geotechnical engineer, pile design and whatever else. We're not there yet. We still have a way to go to make sure that we can manage risk equally well in a computerized world for ground risk. Sadly, I don't know in a way why I'm totally gobsmacked it's taken as long as it has done to replace the human. But those more technical skills will be increasingly commoditized, and the broader ability to deal with really complicated risks will come to the fore. And I think the point that somebody made a number of years ago, or to me, is that sort of in a way the easy projects have been done. We're now into increasingly difficult projects in the middle of cities, and we're actually looking to many more metrics. We're looking to achieve low carbon. We're looking to be actually much better for society. We know we've done a huge damage to biodiversity. We need to fix all of these things. So again, it's not just dealing with humans, it's dealing with all these other aspects of to give a much broader agenda that needs many, many more skills to give the right answer. It's no longer just an engineer, a geotechnical engineer negotiating with a structural engineer. Those are easy interactions. There's much more complicated and fun interactions to have.
No, absolutely. So yeah, so there's a point there around kind of range of skills, but also how they're deployed. I think that kind of mixture of of getting the right people deployed and in the right conversation, so they're not done separately, is probably key to this. Okay, so a few more questions, Tim. You're not off the hook yet. So I've got a compliment. There's lots of love, actually. I'm not going to read those out because you'll get a massive head. So somebody here touching on the known unknowns. And the work that you described around a pre-mortem, you know, trying to sort of get some of that out of people's heads. But what can we do about the unknown unknowns? You know, is this around sort of adding something into the contingency pot? Is it about adding something into the schedule? Or do you just have to cross your fingers and wait? So what, you know, knowing that your Scotch egg is going to grow, how do you think we should be treating that in the kind of project initiation and planning process?
It's a really good question, and therefore there's no easy answer to it, and therefore it's it depends is probably the only answer I can give. If you're doing something which, as I said before, is actually fairly tame in terms of what you're doing, you'd be very unlucky to come up with something really bad. But actually, again, mitigation always matters. So speaking as somebody who's spent the first decade of my career arguing for more site investigation, I get continuously gobsmacked by the fact that many clients still try and skimp on it, and especially the desk study where you learn the range of risks that might take place in the site. For less than 10 grand, you can discover a huge amount about what's actually happening, and therefore you're not quite so blinded by things sort of later on. So if you go into a world and if you sort of say, I've got a greenfield site, I do a few trial pits, I'm sure it's okay, and I cross my fingers, I might have done quite a cheap site investigation, but by saving that 10 grand on a desk study, I just don't know what risks I might need to expect. If I do a desk study and go back to some old maps, I might find there's history of mining in the area, and therefore I might find a much better range of unknown unknowns. So curiosity, I think, is actually one of the main aspects of it, being alive to risk and actually investing and trying to discover it. Again, I come across many projects where people leave the site investigation till later in the process, and even on some quite major infrastructure projects, the site investigation doesn't get until later. So therefore, that information is not available till earlier. Again, if you're going to spend the money, I see no reason whatsoever to do this. I'm dealing with a major metro scheme in another country, where the client is assuming the contractor is going to do the proper site investigation. Small amount of site investigation has been done at an early stage, enough as the client thinks to actually characterize how they're going to build the metro, but not enough to actually make sure that there's proper risk transfer to the contractors. The contractors are going to turn up, they're going to have to change the alignment, and they're going to have to change probably station locations. They may need to change the station shapes. Huge amount of change is going to happen. They're going to say that's unknown unknowns, and I'm going to go, if they'd actually spent a bit more money at the beginning, they would discover the rock head level would vary an awful lot more than they expect. They would discover very, very different groundwater conditions to what they're actually currently showing, and they are going to be plagued by unknown unknowns. So I said before about mitigation of risks, but actually discovery of risks. It's a really good question. I should have actually probably said more about discovery of risks. If you're open and look for risks and actually resource people, and it didn't take very much money. I mean, in the context of a £3 or £4 billion metro scheme, spending £1 million at the outset on a really good desk study is one of the best value investments you might make. Not doing it means you'll be plagued by unknown unknowns. So in terms of what you might do, add 10% contingency, 10% of the schedule, cross our fingers. Those might help. The first two a bit more possibly. And actually, it's an interesting point about the optimism bias that the Green Book used to push for. And again, I was always a bit skeptical about optimism bias. I think it's been misused quite a lot, because I've seen it being used as a substitute for looking for things. And it's an allowance that's there. And having too big a contingency doesn't necessarily help you, because it doesn't mean that you have the right amount of money still. Looking for risks and understanding them, discovering them and mitigating them. And you should get lots of reward for doing that properly. So really good question. And I think a large part of this is actually trying to work out how we do that.
Yeah, no, I think your point on discovery is well made. I think there's a piece around getting, maybe that comes from the sort of pre-mortem triggering what you need to spend the time and the effort on in discovery. I would also suggest that if you are trying to take a slightly more sophisticated approach to risk, you will be opening up those channels of communication. You will be establishing quite a resilient governance structure, so that when you encounter the unknown unknowns, you've at least sort of brought everybody to the table, and hopefully you're in a position where you've set up the governance and the incentivization such that you are wanting to all kind of collaborate and solve them, rather than have an unknown and then the whole project just falls over and starts to disintegrate. Right, we've got a few more to get through, so I'm going to kind of hurry us along. Shorter answers, please, Tim. I'm wax lyrical on this, but so there's a very direct question here about whether the construction playbook moves sufficiently in the direction of accepting the risks on a project and facilitating collaborative risk management. So does the construction playbook chapter on risk go far enough, do you think, Tim?
For a sketchy, quite short book, I think it's absolutely excellent. I mean, I really, really, really love the construction playbook. I think it's brilliant. And coupled with the Green Book and the Orange Book, there's actually lots in there. But what I like about the construction playbook is the fact it looks actually broadly at everything. So it moves away from the narrow, very, very narrow lens of least capital cost and into achieving proper, broader, longer, bigger value of a whole range of things. And therefore, it gives the opportunity to actually look at everything much more holistically. So I think we've been given permission by government to do all the things we've whinged about for my entire career. And we actually now, we now can do a good job. We're no longer looking at things through the wrong lens of least capital cost. And we can actually make sure that we can achieve better outcomes as designers, constructors, and everybody else.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And as you say, it's a policy document, so there is a need to sort of take those principles and I think, deploy our expertise to fill the gap, shall we say. Okay, right, so there's an interesting question coming in on the integration of risk management and value management. So I know that's something that you've looked at quite extensively in terms of the two swim lanes. Perhaps you want to just elaborate a little bit on how that might work in practice, and maybe the other elements of the value toolkit, which are more focused on sort of value definition and measurement.
Yeah, and again, it's a really good question again, because we were wondering whether we should be the same people. And I think the people are different. I mean, especially on a very major project, they're probably very different people. Interestingly, the people, I as a geotechnical engineer was doing risk management, and Natalie Croft and Tony G was doing value management, also a geotechnical engineer. So maybe geotechnical engineers are wasted doing geotechnical engineering is one conclusion. but mildly tongue-in-cheek. But actually, I think that there is a different range of skills required, but the two of them should be much more closely together. And all too often, risk management is about dealing with technical risks and not about dealing with broader risks. And the broader risks need to be much more alive to. So there needs to be a really good dialogue. But on a big project, I think they're probably different people with different skills, but they should be integrated and talking frequently.
Okay, well, as a reservoirs engineer, I think geotechnical engineers should stick to making mud pies. Okay, so just a final question now, and this is I knew this one was going to come up. So we see a lot of clients being advised to place all the risk with contractors. How do we change that culture? What do you think your sort of learning and advice is? Is that a wise move to place it all with the contractors? Is it ever a wise move?
Sorry, if it's a team set of risks and it's a very well-defined problem, it's actually the really, really good approach. So I'm a fan of DnB for many situations. I do a lot of DnB work. It can be challenging, it can be tough, and the risk management can be actually more tricky. But overall, it's a good way of doing things in a set of situation. And there's then various forms of DnB and various ways of actually doing things. It's not just actually DnB or not DnB. There's many ways of involving contractors earlier to make bring their skills into the overall sort of value set or skill set of the project and others. But changing the culture is critical. And I think the whole idea, I will mildly castigate overuse of transactional delivery model. And that's in a way what we set out to do at the very beginning, recognizing that it was one that was being very overused. The risk comes back to clients. Even when clients get a GMP, it's never a proper very rarely is a proper GMP. Change happens, and all that a GMP does is actually mean that the negotiation becomes much more complicated. NEC brings everything onto probably a more rational basis of actually looking at things. It's more edifying, it's more fact-based. You actually look through the compensation events and do them in a much better way. But also that's not a panacea either. Many clients get a feeling that actually it ends up being a bit more by NEC. That we need to find a way where we actually just change doesn't happen. We make sure that it's actually, if we get to the delivery stage, we have got all the things sorted. So we all know if we resource the early stages better and give enough time and a proper team approach to solving things, a huge amount less risk will take place later on, and therefore the whole construction industry will be better, far less adversarial, and we will all be happier and less stressed in our jobs. And we're all looking forward and working towards that day.
Oh, that's such an Arup response there. That's a place. No, I think absolutely, and I really enjoy the risk categorization, because as you said, that can point you towards when it is appropriate to be moving down that. The contractors will be able to mitigate and manage these risks, and when they won't. So I think that's that to my mind is a really interesting kind of self-reflection for the clients, and hopefully some of their, as you say, some of their expert advisors alongside them to kind of conduct that process. So there's a very final question which I will take around the articulation of value and how important that is. Absolutely, and I think that is why during the as part of the sort of wider value toolkit, there is a complete strand on that. And on that, sort of value definition piece as an input to kicking off what we would be doing around risk and sort of making those assessments and those self-reflections. Okay, so I think, Tim, thank you ever so much for your time today. That was a one-man show. It was very good. Really appreciate you taking the time to share that. And I hope you're not too worn out at the end of the day. So just to conclude, I just wanted to flag to everybody, we have got, this is one of a number of webinars we're doing around the future of consultancy. So you can see Tim is coming back for more. He just loves them so much. But we have got a number of topics coming up. So we've got 2 on pricing. We've got one around how the consultancy pricing models might shift and what we can learn from other industries. So a bit of a focus there on digital transformation. We have got Siemens on that. So Nick Smith there from Siemens is going to sort of give us the insider knowledge about how they price in terms of being a technology firm compared to us. And I think there'll be some really interesting learning there. So Tim, you're back for that one. We also have pricing from the other side of the table. So this is a kind of client focused webinar looking at, how should the clients approach getting consultants into contracts that get the best out of them. So what revenue models and things should they unpick? And that's with Emma Jane Houghton, who is the commercial director on the 40 hospitals. So hopefully get some insights there around how she's going to get the best out of the consultants in her supply chain on that program. And then also we've got a 2 where we're looking at sort of a bit more about the what rather than the how. So we're looking at the future roles and services for consultants. We have Paul Tremble doing that, and that's a bit around trying to sort of showcase really what is on offer and what has changed. And then we have the mirror image of that with the contractors. So we've got Alistair Reisner and Craig Huntbatch there talking about what the contractors are doing in terms of the new roles and services they're bringing to market as a result of digital transformation. So overall, some interesting viewpoints and snapshots there across the industry. So please do sign up, and they will all be available on our website, so you can catch up again. I can hear in the background my dog is now very excited at the end of the webinar, and he's going to get to go out for a walk. So thank you ever so much, everybody, for joining. Really appreciate you taking the time. I hope you found it useful, and I hope to see you back here again soon. Right, thanks all. Bye.